Hello and welcome. My name is George and my channel is all about helping you get the most out of Logic Pro so that you can record and produce your best music in your home studio. Today, I'm going to give you a few things that you can look at if you're having problems getting sound or hearing yourself in Logic Pro. So let's dive in. So one of the very first things we want to look at if we're having any issues with hearing ourselves or not being able to get sound into Logic is to check our settings and make sure that our audio preferences are set properly. So we'll go up here to Logic Pro, then Preferences, and then Audio. And we want to check our output device and our input device. So our output device is going to be used for playback. So this is how we're going to hear ourselves. So if you're listening using headphones, for example, that are plugged into an audio interface, then you want this set to your audio interface. If you're going to be listening back from the built-in speakers on your computer or laptop, then you want to make sure that you choose built-in speakers. And if you're using Bluetooth headphones, well, you want to look for those as well. One thing to mention is that these audio settings are independent of your usual Mac system preferences. So if I go to my system preferences, for example, under sound, if I have my output set to my audio interface here, but I have it set to something different in Logic, well, Logic is going to go with whatever setting you have in Logic. So that's something to be aware of. I'm going to go back to Logic now. So now that we have our output device set properly, now we can move on to the input device. So this is going to be what we're using to input audio into Logic. So that might be a microphone plugged into your audio interface. So in that case, you want to make sure that you have your audio interface selected. If you're going to be using the built-in microphone of your computer, then you want to select built-in microphone. I'll just give a little disclaimer. If you are going to be using the built-in microphone, make sure you use headphones at the same time. Otherwise, you're quickly going to have a feedback loop on your hands, and that's not going to be a very desirable sound. Now that we have our audio devices all set up, we can close the preferences. And now you can see my first track that I have loaded here is a software instrument track. Now, when you're first getting started in Logic, you might think that now that you have a track loaded in, you should be getting some sound. And if I play on my keyboard, I'm not hearing anything. And the reason for that is we don't actually have an instrument loaded in to this software instrument. So if you go down here under instrument, you can see that that's currently blank. So in this case, you'll want to go down here and select one of the many instruments that are available to you. We'll just go to the sampler, for instance. And from here, we can choose a piano, perhaps. And now we can hear our piano. Now, a similar mistake that happens quite often is when you're creating a new track, you may go and create an external MIDI track. In this case, you might see this little piano here and think that there's a piano ready to go. And if I play here, you'll see some signal there, but we're not hearing anything. And this is similar. Once again, there's no instrument loaded in. An external MIDI track requires an external keyboard or sound module to replicate the sound that way. So you're not going to be performing sound that's built into the computer like we did with the software instruments. You're going to be triggering sounds that's outside of the computer and then bringing that back in via audio using your audio interface. So an external MIDI track is not one that's often used for most people. If I go back to my software instrument track for a moment, if, for example, I had my piano loaded in like we did earlier, but I still wasn't hearing any sound, then you want to make sure that your MIDI keyboard is actually sending MIDI to Logic. And one way to check that, if I play a chord on my piano, you'll see up here, it's telling me what I played. So you can see that MIDI is indeed getting inputted into Logic. So if you're not seeing any notes up here, then you know that there's an issue with Logic receiving MIDI from your keyboard. So you want to check your connections there. So if you're sending MIDI using USB, make sure the USB cable is plugged in both into your keyboard and your computer. If you're using actual MIDI cables, then you want to make sure that those cables are plugged into your keyboard and that they're going to your audio interface as well. Now let's move on to an audio track. So I'll hit the plus button to create one here, go to audio, and I'll hit create. I'll just drag this down quickly. Now, in order to actually see any signal on here, you want to make sure to click the little R here. So if I click that, now you can see some signal that's coming in from my microphone. If you're not seeing that, then you want to make sure that you have the right channel selected. So if you go down here, you can see I'm currently on channel 1, which is where my microphone's plugged in. And if I were to change this to, let's say, input 2, now I'm no longer getting signal on this track because my microphone is plugged into input 1 and I have input 2 selected, which is another thing not to get mixed up about is even though this track is called audio 1, I can set the input to whatever I'd like. So as you can see right now, it's on input 2. Now I'm just going to quickly go back to input 1. So now let's say that you've got the correct input selected. You can see signal, but you're still not hearing yourself. The next thing to try would be to hit this little I button right here, which is input monitoring. And if you click that button and you can now hear yourself, well, then that's great. And I'll show you the setting you can change if you prefer just to be able to hear yourself right away without having to click on input monitoring. So if we go up here once again to Logic, Preferences, and then Audio, and if we go to General, here you'll see Software Monitoring, which is checked. So you will want that checked in order to hear yourself through Logic. And then you'll see this Input Monitoring, which is currently unchecked for me. So that means that as soon as I hit the record button, I'm going to be able to hear myself. If that wasn't the case for you and you needed to hit the input monitoring button, that means that this is likely checked. So this just creates a second step to be able to hear yourself. So that'll be up to you whether or not you want to have this checked or unchecked. Now, while we're on the subject of software monitoring, what software monitoring means is that you're hearing yourself through Logic. So in the case of me speaking right now, I'm speaking into the microphone, which is going into my audio interface, which is going into Logic, and then the audio would pass through any plugins that I have loaded, which is currently nothing. But if I did have some reverb or things like that, those would get processed, and then the audio would go back out through my audio interface and out of my speakers or my headphone, and I would hear any of the effects that are applied on here. Now, there is another way that you can hear yourself, which is by turning that off and actually monitoring yourself directly from your audio interface. And in that case, for the same example, I'm speaking into my microphone and then that's going to my audio interface. But instead of the audio getting passed through to Logic first, it's going to go right back into my headphones or my speakers. Now, the advantage of that is it cuts down on a bit of latency, which is the delay from having to go through the computer and back out there. So there's a short delay that happens for that process to take place. But the downside of it is I'm not going to hear any of the effects that I've placed on my track in Logic. So I'm just going to get the dry signal from my audio interface. Now, in saying that, there are some interfaces that have built-in effects, such as the UA interfaces. So in those cases, you can apply effects directly from the audio interface itself. But for most people, you're going to be monitoring directly from Logic using software monitoring. So I'm going to close this. And now if you're still not hearing yourself, you want to make sure that you have your outputs set correctly. So I'm going to open up my mixer by pressing the letter X, or you can do so by clicking this icon up here. And you'll notice here that my output is set to stereo out. Now if I click here, you can see stereo out. Now most audio interfaces, stereo out or outputs 1 and 2 are going to be your main outputs. However, a lot of audio interfaces will have multiple outputs. And so you want to make sure that you are indeed going to the correct ones. And as I said, usually that's going to be stereo output 1 and 2. But in some cases, if your audio interface has 2 headphone outputs, sometimes output 1 and 2 will be headphone 1 and output 3 and 4 will be headphone number 2. So if you're plugged into headphone 2, for example, and that's routed for audio outs 3 and 4, then you're not going to be hearing what you're outputting in Logic because it's getting sent to a different output. So to rectify that, you can usually change the routing for your audio interface in the audio interface software. So you want to open up that software and you want to find where you can have the settings for your main outputs, your speakers, and your headphones, and set those to be audio out 1 and 2. Sometimes there'll be a switch directly on your audio interface as well. That'll switch your headphone outputs from 1 and 2 to 3 and 4. So you want to check that out too. So hopefully that's helped you get a clear understanding on some of the settings in Logic and how things are routed, and help you make sure that you get sounds and are able to hear yourself when using Logic Pro. If you're just getting started and want to improve your workflow in Logic Pro, don't forget to download my free Logic Pro hotkey cheat sheet by following the link in the description below. If you have any more questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one.